So the breadbasket. So this would be nice. That this is all I had to say. I wish I could just say, yep, the breadbasket's flat, close up the laptop and get the hell out of here. I wish that's the case. But that's one of the key things about this area is it's extremely flat. So that flat terrain is very conducive to the high agricultural output that we find here. And this area is called the breadbasket for a key reason. It's called the breadbasket for its agricultural productivity. But more than just ag. We also have pigs, we've got cows, we've got buffalo, so we've got livestock as well. So there's a good amount of grazing and livestock here that we also can throw into that whole breadbasket idea. So essentially this is the area that feeds America, as they would say there, with great pride there in the breadbasket. And so once again, we're going to start off kind of talking about the physical aspects and then move along and at the same time kind of try to talk about some human characteristics while sprinkling in some current issues. So we're going to hopefully, one of the things is you guys is we all don't have the same text here, but it's kind of interesting that we're all kind of talking about the same ideas. So I wonder if textbooks are even useful in the future. But anyway, so here's the Great Plains, and so it's kind of got this jagged design, but we definitely can see a very clear characteristic is all within this nice little red box, very, very smooth, very little change in the colors, let's say. So if you're just going to be fixated on the colors, there's not that much color change here, man. So what that idea is, this is quite flat. Whereas here, you can see the color change very much shows that rugged topography that we find here, and of course, a little bit there along our east coast that we've already covered. So let's go ahead and throw up our topographical profile map. So one of the things is on a future exam, maybe, one of the things is if you can draw something, damn, I think you know what you're talking about, if you can draw something. So if you could maybe draw something, damn, that would show that you really know the topographic profile of the North America area, especially by deciphering the different names of those different shapes that one could draw to showcase mastery of a concept. But if we zoom in, we can focus in on our Great Plains / Corn Belt / overall all-encompassing breadbasket. We can see it lies there in the central lowlands and the Great Plains. So the breadbasket overlaps two regions, the central lowlands and the Great Plains. The central lowlands, of course, we talked a little bit about last time when we were talking about the foundry, but we're definitely going to hit more of the central lowlands here today in the breadbasket. So very, very, very flat. And we've talked about this as far as the reason why the Great Plains kind of has that tilt, and it's all about banging over here has caused uplift to cause this very, very flat area, especially on the western edge, to become lifted. And so what that means is the rivers, of course, this is a key concept. Maybe you learned this, maybe you haven't, but water, it always goes downhill. And so that water that always goes downhill, we can pretty much go ahead and predict that the rivers in the breadbasket, for the most part, go west to east. And that has to do with the topographic profile. We can see that tilt that slants towards, in this case, the Mississippi River. So pretty much all rivers in this area flow to the east, a very general west to east pattern. And so we zoom in, we can see here is our good friend, the breadbasket, comprising the Great Plains and the central lowlands. So if we go back and, once again, why am I doing the map quizzes? It's not, I know this might be what you think, it's not just so I can create points, in which I can create a nice, cute little grade book and then fill it out and all of that. It's so that we know concepts. It's so we know where places are when I'm trying to describe things. And so the Great Plains, because we now know where the Rocky Mountains are, sit to the east of the Rocky Mountains. Also, we can see the various rivers. We've got our good friend the Missouri River, but also our good friend the Mississippi River spend a good chunk of their time inside the breadbasket. Places where the breadbasket also overlaps, of course, is the Great Plains, but we see the Great Plains does not encompass all of that. And so we have this different area over here, different characteristic vegetation type, but they also have a much different agricultural type in which they're producing a whole lot different ag here compared to there. Further, we've got this little guy right there. This is the this is the Ouachita Mountains. So these are part of Dixie, so we're not going to cover those. So this is very much a broad area that's bordered by the Rocky Mountains on one side, the Canadian Shield on another, but then over here we've got the Mississippi River, but also those mountain ranges here in Arkansas that kind of act as a nice divider for much of the eastern part of this Great Plains area. If we go back in time, keep in mind this area was heavily influenced, just like Indiana, by glacial activity. So if we go back, once again, Rockies, Appalachians, all of that. So if we go back before the glacier period, the Missouri River and the Ohio River, they didn't exist. They didn't exist until after the glacier came in and advanced. So the Missouri River, thus, just like the Ohio River, is at the location of that most recent glacial boundary. And so where that most recent glacier stopped, we see the formation of these key rivers. Now there's no doubt the Ohio River has played a key role, particularly before railroads, in moving those Germans that you talked about through the Midwest and throughout this area. So the Ohio River, of course, we're going down slope here, going from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, and so a lot of people that settled this area essentially rode the Ohio River. Whereas over here, we've got a different pattern. So anyone that would be traveling west would have to be going upstream. That's also the characteristic of going upstream on the Mississippi River. But of course, things have changed over time to allow people then, of course, to move upstream or just to move stuff. And that key thing is the railroads. So who cares about moving stuff upstream when you can essentially use a railroad? So that's a key characteristic, is this area, really the rivers don't explain settlement per se. Instead, the railroads help to explain settlement. So we're going to come back and talk about different transportation mechanisms and how they've left their impact. And so the transportation mechanisms we talked about over here, walking, streetcars, thus a very densely populated area. Here we're going to see places that are very much tied to the location of railroads. So the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, all that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And so the Great Plains, much of it flows all right down in here into the Gulf of Mexico, whether it be maybe parts of some Texas rivers coming through, but for the most part via the Mississippi River. So everything drains through there. Whereas if we go to the northern part of the plains, I guess we've got a situation where we've got up in this area, things head towards the Atlantic. Up there, things head towards the Hudson Bay or to the Arctic Ocean. So for the most part, everything flows to the south and to the east. And so once again, it makes sense why all of our rivers are going that direction, because of the topographic profile I showed you on a previous slide. All right, let's further dissect this whole breadbasket area. And so when I talk about the breadbasket, so maybe for a future exam, you might see an image of the breadbasket in which you're asked to discern the two halves of the breadbasket. And we can kind of see that already, just in the colors, man. We can see a lot of this darker green here, but then it gets lighter. And I try to emphasize that with my arrow. So we can see how vegetation is much more dense, much more plentiful, but then as we go west becomes less plentiful. And key to understanding that is, of course, precipitation. It's much more drier as you go further west. Inverse of that, further east you go, the more moist it gets, the more likely you are to have storms and rain and all that stuff that we used to have here in Indiana. So we can kind of divide up this whole area into two halves. And so I've already tried to do that with the whole colors man stuff, but now let's try to focus in on more as far as the characteristics, as far as what's happening here. And so for all of these images, you're going to see a dashed line right through the middle, and that's me trying to distinguish between the two halves of the breadbasket. So we're going to give them different names, but the simplest name for this area, the Great Plains. Whereas this area I'm going to call the Corn Belt for a good amount of time. So the Corn Belt we're going to describe as this area, and then the Great Plains. So the Corn Belt and the Great Plains. All right. When we think about this area, there are forested areas, and of course the forested areas are going to be more likely to be over here. However, much of this kind of transition area transitions from what we would find further east, tall grass prairies, to what we'd find further west, short grass prairies. So in Indiana, we've got Benton County, this kind of small little county up in west central Indiana. Or whoops, we have a map anywhere? Yeah, we got a map. Benton Central High School, Benton County, right through there. That's pretty much the one area of Indiana that is what we could say is a tall grass prairie. So if you ever would visit that area, you would see more of a tall grass prairie landscape. However, you go further to the west, and you see the grasses, of course, get shorter. And once again, what is that key? What's key to that is precipitation. So even if humans have ravaged this area over time, you would see tall grasses come back and grow more out here in the eastern part, and then short grasses further to the west, key distinguishing the vegetation type. And so we can zoom in, we can see those photos there. Short grass on the top, tall grass there on the bottom. Further different ways to distinguish between...
I don't know what that is.
Cool. Further ways to distinguish the Great Plains is we can then divide up the Corn Belt as far as the type of trees we would find in a particular area. And so if you can kind of see the colors, we got this darker green here. That darker green is the same stuff that we would find over Quebec, much of Quebec. And that's that dark green conifer evergreen forested area. So that forested area we would find up and through here. So if you go to northern Wisconsin, if you go to northern Minnesota, if you go to northern Michigan, you're going to find evergreen pine trees dominating the landscape. So this is, in this case, what we would find naturally here. Of course, the reason why I also chose this photo was the lake. And so these are areas that have been affected by those glacial kettle lakes as well. So you're going to find a lot of those kettle lakes in this northern area of the Corn Belt. So the northern area of the Corn Belt, to be honest, this shouldn't be called the Corn Belt because there's no way in hell corn can be grown there. So corn isn't grown here, but on this whole eastern side of the breadbasket, the northern part, we're going to find pine trees, and as we get further down to the south, we're going to then sprinkle in more deciduous trees. So evergreen trees, quick 411, those are trees that are needles oftentimes that don't lose their leaves. So we also think of them as Christmas trees, whereas we go further south, we get more trees like we see here in autumn here in Indiana, the colorful trees. They're colorful because their leaves are falling off. And so deciduous trees are going to be more prevalent down here on the southern part of that eastern side of the breadbasket area. So we zoom in, we can see the evergreen trees I talked about last time, or a couple times ago, why they're shaped like that, and over time they've evolved to be shaped like that. Like I said, down here, maybe towards Indiana, maybe over here in southern Illinois, parts of Missouri, you would find more of that type of a forest. More of those that we know here very well in Indiana, the deciduous forests, where we have, of course, changing of seasons bringing the loss of leaves or the gain of leaves depending on the season. We all know that story, I hope. And so we zoom in there. And that's what I call that home. Growing up in Indiana all my life, that's the forest I know. I don't know this kind of forest. But that, if you're from the region up there in northern Indiana, maybe that's something you might be more familiar with. But that would make sense because as we go further north, we get more pine trees. When you get out here to the Great Plains, you don't see as much variability. Like I said, you saw kind of this difference, depends on where we are. Whereas the Great Plains, it's pretty much all just nothing but sparse grassland. So there ain't much there. So this is a very typical picture we would see here. Very, very dry scene. So a lot of this has to do with something we talked about beforehand regarding moisture. So warm, moist air comes across the Rocky Mountains, becomes lifted, dumps all of its rain, but that air continues on, and as it continues on quite dry. Since the Rocky Mountains is where it spews all of its moisture. So that air keeps on cruising, but it doesn't have anything with it. It doesn't have any moisture with it, thus creating a very dry characteristic on the backside of the Rocky Mountains. Backside of all the mountainous areas of the West Coast is like that. Particularly, we'll come back to that when we talk about Utah in the empty quarter. And so we zoom in there, we see what I would perceive as a desolate scene, but of course my friend from North Dakota says this is God's country. That's heaven to them. Of course, that wouldn't be heaven to us. All right, now how are we going to grid this thing up? How are we going to figure out how to divide up the land? And so that was mentioned in the discussion. You guys had some great images that I'm going to probably steal from you, copy and paste into a future discussion if I ever teach this course again. But this idea of gridding the entire country, this pattern that we know extremely well in here in Indiana, if you don't believe me, get lost. Go out and drive in the country and get lost. My guess is back. All you got to do is eventually take, all these gridded roads will eventually take you to another road. It'll take you to, by the time you get, maybe 5-10 minutes later, it gets to that bigger road, then you'll know where you are, go one way or the other. Get lost in Ohio, get lost in West Virginia, get lost in Virginia. You're pretty much, you're SOL. You're in the middle of nowhere, roads wind and go back and forth, and before you know it, you're in a different state. So the gridded pattern is very easy, dividing up property, dividing up much of this wide open land. This all started from a guy named Thomas Jefferson, Part 3. I don't know what Part 3 is. Township and range system. So this is our third way in which settlement patterns have been identified in these lectures. The first one being, question mark.
Meets and bounds.
Okay, we'll call it the first one.
Long lots, yeah.
Long lots. So long lots. Where do we see long lots? We see, what's the F for?
French.
First, yeah, okay. Usually we use a 1 for that, Andy. Long lots. 2, what was our second one? Meets and bounds. And then our third is, we could just say grid or the T&P, township and, or TNR, township and range system. So the township and range system is wide Indiana, but all of the breadbasket except for Texas. In Texas, it's just the nature of Texas to do their own thing, but also they're more influenced by Spanish stuff, which, guess what? Mesoamerica will probably talk about their settlement pattern that has more Spanish influence there in Texas. Why does someone not tell me my fly was down? All right. Yikes. All right, so township and range system. Let's see how it works. And so what we got going right through Indiana is we got a principal baseline and a principal township line. And so from that, everything is then divvied up. And so essentially what we can say is we've got this line here. Let's call this line, what are we going to call it? Let's call it the... let's call it the T line. So we got this line here is the T line. So the T line, I got the T line, and then I can go to the right of the T line, or I can go to the left of the T line. But then I also have the baseline. The baseline I can either go up or down, or so it could go up, above, or below. And so then I can then start to say, okay, well, all this area here is left of the T line, but north of the R line. And so now it's kind of like Battleship. You start to divide up areas, you start naming these areas. And so all this area has this nice big name. This is a different area with a different name, and so forth. And so then I can then zero in, and then I can start to actually name and identify various places by zooming into actually the acre level. And so here's how they did this. So here we have principal meridian, a principal baseline, and so then here, T line. So this here is 2 to the south of the T line. This box is also 1, 2, 3 west of the R line. And so now we divide up this whole area into a specifically named section. And this specifically named section is what we now know as a township. So our townships. We think about who wants to show off all their knowledge of townships in Marion County? Who knows them?
Washington.
All right, let's see if we can do it. There's 9 of them, right?
Central, Washington.
Central, Washington,
Wayne.
Pike, Wayne, Warren, Franklin, Lawrence, Perry, Decatur. Each of those are a township. Each of those are 6 miles by 6 miles, which is exactly what we have here. So they're 36 square miles. And so what they did is they divided everything up, and we know this now. We know our townships of Marion County, just like the townships there in North Dakota, are each 6 mile by 6 miles. And this is all goes to this specific township and range system. And so the idea was, let's divide it up. And so this is the origins of the whole township idea. The same thing goes for other counties, I believe. Johnson, we've got White River, Pleasant maybe, I don't know, Clark, so forth. And so all of our surrounding counties, for the most part, have this pattern here. The only things that are different is when we throw in maybe a river, can kind of separate this and divide up things. But we can relate to this whole idea here of a township. This was a plan that was put forth throughout much of the entire country. And so what we can then do is we got our 6 mile by 6 mile So this is 6 miles by 6 miles. So essentially I just zoomed in to this specifically named box. I can go even further, and I can name a 1 mile by 1 mile section. And we're not going to have to know too much about this, but so now I've divided up all of the entire United States, and now I've zoomed into the 1 mile by 1 mile area. So you can see how this becomes a much easier way to define and describe who owns property, who has what. Further, you can just keep on going even further. I can say this gets really confusing. I can say that the lake is at the southwest quarter of Section 14, T2S R3W. Now you're probably saying, well, what the hell, Andy? This is stupid. If you go to the courthouse, you own property somewhere in Indiana. This is how it's explained. This is how it's defined. It's not defined, 3123 Rose Petal Avenue. It might say that, but it also gives you a specific description of that location. So we can see how this makes sense and how it's a much easier way to divide up property than, especially the meets and bounds, in which you have these haphazard kind of, as time goes on, you say, all right, well, I'll go over here, or you're over there. This is something that's been in action since the 1800s, and we still see it today.
Okay, so I know we get like township line road is the edge of a township. It says range up there. Is that where things like range line?
Exactly, range line road. That's exactly where it comes from. So range line road is a range line. So a lot of the roads that we see here in Indiana, especially when you get further away from the metropolitan area, you can really see it, are just these right here. And so a farmer might have a huge field, and so their road might go all the way around him. So all that might be just their property there. But you can see how this pattern starts to play itself out over time as roads then become the section lines. And if you'll notice, if you're way out in the country doing Lord knows what, going for a cruise, you'll notice that occasionally you have a zigzag, maybe. I don't know if you've noticed that, a zigzag.
They're all over the place up north.
Yeah.
All over the place up north.
They curve sometimes too.
Any idea why we would do that? Keep paving companies with jobs?
People who bought land before the system was in place?
These are longitude lines. So longitude lines, if we think about our bit from the Earth, longitude lines, they bend. So these lines here have to compensate for the curvature of our surface. So they're all eventually, these longitude lines are going to meet at one point, the North Pole or the South Pole. So to compensate for that, they have these zigzags. We don't, of course, want curvy roads. So that's why we see the zigzag, which is a bit off topic, but hey, we're learning. So like I said, if you don't believe me, just go to the courthouse. It might be an archaic way to do things. I mean, you might perceive that. But this is how all of our property here in Indiana is divided up, much like much of the Great Plains. Now let's go back to the 1800s. In the 1800s, let's go back to right during the Civil War. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln came up with the Homestead Act of 1862. Why is this important? This is very critical for populating the Great Plains and the Corn Belt and the Breadbasket. So keep in mind, up until this point, much of the population of the United States lives on the eastern edge, or they live there along the Great Lakes and along those industrial towns that are booming like Chicago, Pittsburgh, what have you. So this was still a lightly populated area. It remains that way still to this day. However, after 1862, there was a rather noticeable increase in population that occurred in the breadbasket. Since then, since about the 1950s, the breadbasket's actually been depopulating, which is something we'll talk about at the end. The key to populating the Great Plains and the Corn Belt and all of that was the 1862 Homestead Act. 270 million acres. And so the United States kind of had this problem. So they were at war, they were in debt, they needed to make some money. Same thing, but 150 years from then. But anyway, so we've got this problem also of these pesky Indians, pesky Native Americans. So it was seen as a way of, well, how can we make some money, but then also help kind of get people to move out to the west and help kind of clear the area of all the Indians and all the Native Americans from there. And so the idea was, well, let's just give them land. And so if you want land, if you're willing to go out there, we'll give you land, and we'll give you, but then in return, we get some money for that. So you have to buy land, but you have to buy it at a very, very cheap price. So essentially, if you just said, okay, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to build a house. I'm going to spend at least 5 years there, so I'm not going to just kind of take the money and run, take the land and run, and I'm going to try to improve it, i.e. farm it, then, yeah, boom, you got it. You got that land. And we're talking, you're given a 160-acre parcel. So that's quite big as far as the amount of land. And so this was no doubt an incentive for people to migrate from the foundry, migrate especially from New England where they have very crap soil, also in the Philadelphia area, Pittsburgh, all these areas. You come out here like, wow, look at all this flat terrain. And I'm getting essentially paid, or paying nothing to come out here and have this big wide open spaces. Why not? Who was really about it? Germans. So the Germans really were the ones that helped to populate this area during the after the Civil War, after the 1862 Homestead Act, and we really saw that German migration to this particular area. And so Germans moved from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and kept on cruising, going further west. And this was fueled by the Homestead Act of 1862. All right, so we zoom in, we'll see the population density map. And once again, I've got my fictitious line going right through the middle. And my fictitious line, though, I think does a good job of separating more of a populated section of the breadbasket and a less populated section of the breadbasket. And so now we can further describe further differences between the two halves of the breadbasket. One half, much more populated, much more settlement of various sizes. Big cities, small cities, medium-sized cities. We're out here, nothing but small towns that are sparsely spaced from each other. You talk about football games. Football games up in this part of the country. The teams will travel on average 250 miles to go play on Friday night. Because that's the nearest competitor. And so a lot of these schools, what they've done is they've mapped the distance that the different conferences have to travel, and it's ginormous. So you just think about how spaced out a lot of these small towns are. Further, they play 9-on-9 football. They don't play 11-on-11 because of the lower numbers. So you have these small towns that no doubt are producing football players and no doubt are mad about football. They all travel 250 miles to go watch their team play. But it's also, you can understand how sparsely populated and how it affects just the high school games and all of that. I don't know, maybe I failed at that one. Anyway, so we've got different cities. So there are various cities from a previous map quiz. We can kind of see how the region has this, exactly what Chris or Sean? What's that?
Seth.
Seth. I knew it was S, or close to that. I knew it was one syllable. Yeah, anyway. As he mentioned, was kind of the breadbasket's kind of on the periphery of it has these major cities. And that's very noted. Denver, we've got Houston, Dallas, St. Louis, Indianapolis, you could say Chicago, are all kind of on the edge of the breadbasket. But what's happening here is you're starting to see a lot of these cities that are right here along this line really start to grow. And so you've got Omaha, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, a lot of these Kansas City. A lot of these cities right on the edge of this very sparsely populated, more densely populated area are really starting to see growth. And so while much of the breadbasket is actually declining, what's happening is these rural individuals are moving to these bigger cities in the nearby. So these cities are growing, whereas much of these rural areas are actually declining. And so they're calling these sponge cities. They're essentially, as especially young people move from the rural areas, they're attracting young people because young people like cool things. Further, Facebook, Twitter, and all of that, they're aware of other things. They're aware of other ideas. And so now they're moving to these nearby big cities that are becoming bigger. And so one of the things that we're seeing is this rural to urban migration, particularly amongst young people, which will be a focus here at the end after our halftime discussion. All right, continuing right along. Very sparsely populated through there. If you didn't know, now you know. All right, so let's go some deep thoughts here. Why does flat land plus many nearby streams and rivers make a happy farmer? Why are they cool with that? What's that? Easier to irrigate. Easier to irrigate. What does that help to explain? Which one?
The streams and rivers, but then it's flat, so they can actually plant and then harvest easily.
Why do we not like steep slopes for ag?
Thing like plow uphill.
Plowing, so that's one thing. So we can say plowing. So why do we not like that? And why do we like that? First off, of course, this is going to be more difficult going up or down to plow to deal with.
The water will run off of the steep slope.
Exactly. It's all about water. And so if we think about rain, it's just going to come down the slope and go right down. And so that water is not going to stick around there on the steep slope, either side. Whereas if water falls here, it's essentially going to sit there, and it's going to have to work its way through the groundwater, or maybe work its way to a meandering stream somewhere nearby. And so flat surfaces are great for ag, because it does a good job, or I guess we'll say it does a poor job of draining. It essentially does a good job of having water stay close to the surface for a longer period of time. And so flat surfaces we like, because of that idea of being able to hold and retain water for a longer period than our steeper slopes. Further, nearby streams and rivers. And so Dan mentioned the fact that irrigating, so if you have a nearby stream or river, you can then, of course, create a man-made irrigation ditch coming off of that river, and then thus use that water to plow your flat field, to agriculturalize your flat field. And so that would be one idea as well. So being close to rivers and streams, especially where they all come together, but also being in a flat area, that's what we like for good ag. So that equals a happy farmer. And so we can kind of try to relate that to the differences we see here in ag. So once again, more differences from the one side versus the other. And so as I'm teaching this, I'm like, wow, this is going to sound like a very good written description question. Kind of describing the two different halves of the breadbasket. So in this, the eastern half, we've got a high prevalence of dairy, corn, and hogs. And trust me, I have the data that shows this. I've got plenty of maps that show this. And so on the eastern side, where we've got that dense vegetation, we also have our flat surfaces from the glaciers. We also have a little bit more moisture, and so we're going to have a little bit more ag here. Particularly corn. We're going to come back and talk about corn here in a minute, but corn requires a lot of water. So that's why we don't see corn grown too heavily out here in the Great Plains. So corn is going to be more likely to be grown out here in the eastern half for the reasons I already mentioned. Further, dairy. If you don't know anything about Wisconsin, they like their cheese. So much they wear cheese heads at football games to show that. So this is an area in which dairy is much more prevalent. Further, Indiana, we're known for having a lot of hogs, a lot of pork. So we eat a lot of bacon, we eat a lot of pork here. And we're more likely to find all the kind of corn and hogs and soybeans kind of all go together. And they all kind of, essentially the corn is used to feed the pigs. Why do people like feeding the corn to pigs? So pigs can get really nice and fat. And when pigs get nice and fat, they taste really good. And so if you really think about trimming off all that fat off of the back of a hog, sizzle that sucker. And so we've got this kind of this pattern here where corn, hogs, soybeans, they all pretty much stay in the same spot. They overlap with each other. Over here, you go to the other side, the other half of the breadbasket, you're going to find more of our grains. So think about a lot of the materials for beer. As we mentioned, beer was a very highly consumed in this area. That makes sense because they have a lot of the components for beer found in this particular area. So wheat is traditionally what we think about. So we think about this area being heavily wheat, whereas here we're more corn. Key differences there. Further, a lot more grazing, as they also mentioned. And grazing is more than buffalo, it's also cows. So cows, cattle grazing, essentially, cows, they require a lot of land. So what you have out here is you've got wide open spaces that cows can just roam freely. Buffalo can roam freely. But it'd be nice if you had something to keep them in, though, right? We'll come back to that idea a little bit later as far as what keeps all those large grazing animals in your little area. What keeps them from running off to your buddy's field. Anyway, so of course we're going to have a bevy of maps, and once again, I hope this showcases the fact that we've got a higher quantity of corn being produced on the eastern half compared to the western half. Interesting thing, corn. So here's corn. Here's a photo from Monrovia, maybe. Somewhere in that area, just south and west of here. So corn. Corn is requires a lot of nutrients. So corn, some would say corn is not good for a soil. What does that mean?
Sucks all of it.
Corn essentially sucks up all the nutrients. Corn sucks up all the nutrients so it can grow nice and tall, and all of that throughout a quick summer there it grows very quickly. And corn sucks up a lot of nutrients. So corn requires a lot of water and with probably higher precipitation levels. Which, wait a minute though, right through here, this is quite dry, and I just said corn requires a lot of nutrients, but especially water. Where the hell are they getting their water from? Yeah, rivers a little bit, especially through here. You can see the Missouri River coming through there, but there are really not too many robust rivers right through there. We'll have to come back to that idea then.
Oh, the cold front.
I'm whetting the appetite. I can just feel the tension. All right. Corn. Why do we find corn and beans in the same place?
Because they alternate seasons, because soybeans put the nutrients back into the soil.
Boom. Boom shakalaka. So soybeans put nutrients back into the soil. And so here you're a farmer. What you'll do is you'll have one season. If you live out in the rural areas, you already know this. You'll have one season in which you'll plant nothing but corn in a field or a particular plot. Then the next season, you might just have it go, fallow? Is that the term? Where you just kind of just let it be. Or you might plow it and then plant soybeans the next year, because then the soybeans put nutrients back into the soil. And so if you were just planting corn every single year, essentially you would end up having no more soil left. All the good stuff, all the creamy, juicy stuff would be sucked out. The nutrients would no longer be there. And so that's why farmers alternate between corn and soybeans. It's because corn take up nutrients where soybeans put nutrients back in. Which we definitely, this crop rotation is the broad term for this. So this explains why corn and soybeans, as we'll see in this next map, they pretty much are the same spot. Corn and beans, corn and beans. And soy is becoming more popular again, so soy is actually seeing increases. I don't know why. I think it's because people think it's healthy. Is that right? Probably it's health. It's becoming kind of a...
gluten-free.
What's that?
I think it's gluten-free.
Gluten-free, there you go.
It's good for lactose intolerant people too.
Yeah, which I guess are increasing?
Well, soy milk, yeah, and I've heard a lot of people drinking less milk nowadays.
Cool. All right. Now let's further ask some more deep questions. If you're a G110 All-Star, G110 Intro to Human Geography All-Star, you should already know these answers. All right. So 1927, the Corn Belt states produced 26 bushels per acre. In 2009, 165 bushels per acre. The acres haven't changed. An acre is still an acre. It's been an acre since 1927. So the acres haven't changed. Why are we producing so much more out of that same acre today than we did historically?
Technology.
Technology. Tech. Further describe technology.
The methods used to actually plant, they can get more out of their acre, like if they line it up systematically, as opposed to using the 26. And then also when they harvest it, like they get more of it.
We're talking the role of machines.
Mm-hmm.
The role of machines, they don't make mistakes. The role of machines, they're going to get every square inch of that acre. Further, these tractors, I looked them up last night. John Deere tractors are equipped with GPSs. You could actually have someone who's kind of like a one-star or on-star, whatever that is, where you can actually contact someone and they'll help you out. So these have very sophisticated logistics and electronics, and it's all about efficiency. And so the machines, the technology that we use, we're not leaving one little corner of these acres unturned. And so mechanization. So think of this farm technology, farm tractor technology, I guess, would be maybe what we'll call that. There's a different type of technology that I'm going to talk about maybe next. Another key reason why we're producing so much damn corn out of that same amount of acreage.
Fertilizer?
Fertilizer. So the other technology, fertilizer. So what do you go to Purdue for? You go to Purdue so you can design and create various agrochemicals that will help things grow better than they've ever grown before. So that's kind of one of the things that they do at Purdue. It's very much an agricultural focused school. And so what are the science and tech and engineer people doing? They're coming up with ways in which corn can be produced much more plentiful than it ever has before. So that includes fertilizer, that includes all aspects of the entire farming practice. And so fertilizers, you've got the selective breeding, and so the creation of seeds. And so you get crossbreeding of various seeds. And so the quick 411 there, you take Tamika Catchings, the world's best female basketball player. You combine her with Paul George, the world's best male basketball player. Tamika Catchings plus Paul George equals super baby. So essentially the idea there, you take two super great qualities of something, you fuse them together, you're going to create a super crop. And so that's another thing they're doing at Purdue. Creating crops that are drought resistant, or stuff that's essentially the Chuck Norris of ag. It's not going to break down over time. So fertilizers, crossbreeding, that kind of technology also. And then the last one, crop rotation. So what I just already talked about. Crop rotation was something that wasn't done throughout much of the country like it is today. So crop rotation. So crop rotation would be a third key reason as far as why we're producing so much more. So we're not having our soil go bad over a few years because we're just not corn. So it's that crop rotation which is helping the overall product. So here's the newest John Deere. Maybe this might turn you on, but this is a 500 horsepower tractor. So 500 horsepower. What's NASCAR? I know it's probably about the same as an Indy car as far as horsepower. So we're talking huge suckers. How much did this thing run? I think this was like $699,000, I think maybe. This wheels here.
Really?
Is that cheap? I apologize. Anyway, other things going on. So another thing that's happening is in the Corn Belt, the price of land is quickly going up. And so you're having a situation where 2002, people are paying $3,000 per acre. In 5 years alone, they've increased $2,000 per acre, $2,000 per acre. So why is land in the Corn Belt quickly increasing as far as its price? Why? It's because it's in demand. It's a simple economic lesson. If there becomes demand of something, the price will go up for it because it becomes more scarce. And so why are people why are city slickers from New York and Chicago buying up a bunch of farmland? Because they want to make some money. The big ticket to making money right now in the Corn Belt is ethanol. So ethanol, why do we like ethanol? Broad question. Why is corn-based ethanol becoming something that's used more and more in the Corn Belt?
It's an alternative fuel source.
It's an alternative fuel source, and so it's corn. So it's not petroleum. It's not something that we only have so much of. There's only so much oil. Corn, we can regrow it. We can regrow corn, and so it's not a resource that's going to run out. We can always grow more corn. So that's one thing. It's seen as also a biofuel. So it's not our fossil fuel. It's actually from plant material, of course. Other reasons why we like corn-based ethanol.
It's local.
It's local. And so no doubt we're going to like corn-based ethanol in Iowa, which is that the IndyCar race you mentioned?
Yeah.
And that's the Iowa Corn Indy 250. And so Iowa Corn Association is overwhelmingly the big sponsor and promoter of that race. So they're promoting ethanol because that is the key industry in Iowa. If they plant a bunch of corn in Iowa, of course they're going to try to benefit from the ethanol growth. And so the fact it's local. I think we can also tie in the local with the fact it's domestic. So it's not Iraqi oil, it's not Middle Eastern oil, it's not Venezuelan oil, it's Iowan oil. It's not really oil, it's Iowan fuel. It's fuel from Iowa, it's fuel powered from the heartland. And so another key reason why ethanol was really quickly growing, it's still growing, it was really quickly growing in the 2000s. However, ethanol's recently had some backlash. So ethanol is good. We mentioned all the reasons for that. Why is ethanol not good?
Because if the price of corn goes up, everything else that's made with corn goes up.
Exactly. And so now there becomes a deal where we're growing these crops, Instead of for putting food on the plate for our families, instead it's going to our fuel in our cars. And so what's going to happen there is money producing something that's going to go to cars versus on someone's plate, you're going to do it. And so one of the things is that's now raising prices for corn. Because now corn as a food is in less supply. There's less of it because corn is also now as a fuel, as a biofuel. And so we think about corn. Corn's in everything. Cornstarch. We've got cornstarch. We've got corn syrup. All those various things are loaded with corn. It's in everything. So it affects a lot of candies, a lot of Coke, a lot of pop, all of that good stuff.
And it feeds animals that we eat.
Exactly. So once again, it goes back to why are we fattening up those hogs? We're fattening up those hogs so then those hogs can go to market. And so we see a lot of cattle, a lot of livestock that are added to it as well. Anyway, all right, so we got over here, we've got the Wheatbelt. So the Wheatbelt, obviously where we find wheat, not there in the eastern part, but more in the western part. So with the Wheatbelt, we can find it both there in the southern part. We call that winter wheat, but then in the northern part of the spring wheat. So let's further dissect the agricultural area. And good thing, I know some of you could care less because you're texting the entire time, could care less about this, but I actually on Tuesday did all this preparing. Thank God I did it on Tuesday because these maps are no longer existing because of the government shutdown. So the government shutdown, you can't access this stuff anymore. And so I managed to grab this stuff before the shutdown because I saw it coming. I saw the census and all this going away temporarily. We'll see how long that lasts. But here's cattle, dairy, hogs, and broilers. Broilers are chicken and eggs. So where do we find, and this is pretty much all of them together, so what's the whole geographic about it? Well, let's now look in particular at each one of these suckers. First off, starting with cattle. And where do we find cattle? We're going to find cattle more in the western part of the breadbasket. We're going to find it there in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas. And so these are also some of our big beef-producing states. So Texas produces a ton of steak. Omaha Steaks is a company that produces, that ships all out throughout the country. I had a girlfriend once that was trying to fattening me up. She was trying to get me bigger. She wanted me to be bigger for some reason. So she sent me a bunch of Omaha steaks. And little did we know, we found out that the Atkins diet actually caused you to trim. And so I ate all this meat and I actually lost weight because I was doing the Atkins diet because of that. Anyway, and so where was that steak coming from? It came from Omaha. Omaha steaks. So we can find a lot of cattle grown there, but also Iowa. And so the thing about cattle is wide open spaces. So cattle require big, huge, wide open spaces, and so we think about corn. If we got this land, we could set aside for corn or soybeans or cattle. We're going to choose, if we're over here in the eastern half, we're going to choose corn because our land might not be as big. But if we have big, huge, wide open spaces, it makes more sense for cattle, for livestock. And so that's why we're going to see it here in our big, huge, wide open spaces that are very, very, very rural. Let's look at some art. So this is cool looking art, right? Anyone know what we're looking at? This is cool art. Wow, digging a little deeper. It's cool. Cool. Dig a little
Fields
deeper.
with cows in them?
Those are nothing but fields that are essentially where we have a bunch of cattle that are just sitting here. So this is where your food is coming from, right through here. So we have these huge corporate farms. And so with remote sensing, with aerial photography, beforehand, you couldn't even come close to getting photographs of what happens inside these large mega corporate livestock farms. So with remote sensing and aerial photography, we can now zoom in and figure out and learn what's happening here. And so what's happening here? Why do we see all these bright green colors in this kind of this cesspool here? Waste, poop, cow poop. So cow poop, this is essentially where all this waste eventually goes to, and it's very, very rich. Cow poop is rich, and that's why it's added as a fertilizer a lot of times. And so we can see how that green there, how it's actually creating a situation where we're having this vegetation that's sprouting up there along that cesspool. So essentially we can see here cattle, how it's done here in the Great Plains. And it's done on a very massive scale. Each one of these little suckers, that's a cow. You can see how they kind of all along the fence, all up and throughout everywhere there. These are these massive feedlots that have been now photographed and pass it on the internet, what have you. All right, dairy. And so what do we notice about dairy? Are dairy found near cities or in rural areas? Way out in the middle of nowhere or close to cities? What do we notice about broad picture of dairy? Not so much in the breadbasket, but everywhere. Close to cities or in the middle of nowhere? Fairly close to cities. I mean, of course, got over here LA, Chicago, New York City. Why do you think dairy locates rather close to cities? Because it goes bad quickly. And so it's something it's going to spoil very quickly. And so dairy, whether it be our milk or our cheese, particularly our milk, is going to be one, you're going to probably see more dairy farms located closer to an urban area to serve that market that would require or demand that dairy. Whereas you go out way out in the middle of nowhere, it's because of the distance, it's going to take a longer time. And so over time, we can see how dairy has started to cluster near larger urban areas, larger, more populous areas. And it's all about serving that population with a good that perishes more quickly than wheat or corn, let's say. But where do we find dairy? We can kind of find dairy